You can use any Linux machine as a DHCP server on your network. Stay tuned, we'll show you how to set it up.
You're watching IT Pro TV.
Welcome back for more LPIC 2. I'm here with Dawn, and today's episode is all about building a DHCP server. So what do we need to know before we kind of jump into this episode?
Well, we're going to tackle a few different things. We're going to do the normal stuff, getting the DHCP server installed. Then we'll take a look at a basic configuration and what it takes to really just get this up and running and serving IP addresses on your network. DHCP is really important, so we need to make sure this is a stable, reliable service, and you'll see it's actually pretty easy to do.
So for starters, what software do we need for this?
All right, well, most Linux distributions are not going to have DHCP installed by default. They'll have a DHCP client, but not a DHCP server. So we do have to install something. And the de facto standard for DHCP is the ISC DHCP server. Now, I realize I'm throwing out a lot of acronyms here, so let me back up just a little bit here. If you're not familiar with DHCP, it's the Dynamic Host Configuration Protocol, but if you've made it all the way here to LPIC 2, the odds are you know what that is, right? Just a system that's dynamically handing out IP addresses to clients on the network. We don't want that installed by default because every Linux box that comes up would start handing out wrong addresses, and that would just wreak havoc everywhere. So we need to get it installed. Now, the ISC, if you're not familiar with them, let me bring up their webpage real quick. The ISC is the Internet Systems Consortium, and they've taken over several open source projects that deal with network infrastructure. DHCP just happens to be one of them. So the ISC DHCP server is the standard DHCP server found in Red Hat, CentOS, Ubuntu, Debian, Mint, pretty much every distro that's out there. There are other DHCP daemons available, but ISC's really kind of got the main one. On some distros, they'll just refer to this as DHCP or DHCPD in some cases. But in Ubuntu and Debian, they actually refer to it as the ISC DHCP server. It's very clear that's what it is. So if we want to get up and going with DHCP, we just need to get that installed. Let me jump over to my terminal, and I'll show you how easy that is. So I'm on Ubuntu 20.04, and if I want to install it, I can just say sudo apt install ISC-DHCP-server like that. It's going to find it. There's not a whole lot to it. It's a very simple service. I'll just say yes, and that's going to get that one installed. On some distros, it'll automatically start. On others, it won't, and I actually prefer it not to start because there's certain errors that can happen before we configure it. So it's usually a good idea not to start it right away, go and do some of your other configuration, and then start it up afterwards. But otherwise, we've just installed it.
So what's the minimum configuration that we need to get started?
So the minimum thing that DHCP needs is an IP range, right? So we just need a range of IPs that we can hand out. But that range of IPs needs to match up with an IP address on a network interface on our server. So, we've got to be able to communicate on the same network that we're issuing out addresses. So that's kind of an important thing that we need to have. And to do all this, we need a configuration file. Now, the configuration file follows its own little syntax. It's somewhat unique. It's frustrating is what it is. It's a crazy type thing. But if you know what to put in, there's actually a very small amount of commands that you need. But let me show you, when we installed it, it actually creates an example file for us. If you go into /etc/ /usr/share/doc, this is where a lot of documentation for our services ends up, and you'll see that the DHCP server has its own folder in here, which is ISC-DHCP-server. And if you poke around in here, you'll find a number of different files, including the examples folder. And inside of examples, we'll find dhcpd.conf.example. Now, some people on the internet will say, just copy this file, copy it right over to your config, and then use it. But you'll typically find this has a lot of stuff in it that you just don't need. And let me show you here. I'm going to less that file so we can look at it. And you'll see it has a ton of stuff in there, all heavily documented. So while you could copy this over, it's usually better to just create one from scratch. But this gives us the guidance of what we need to put in our configuration so that we can get it set up. As you look at it, though, you'll see where it's calling out the various things that we need to create, like an IP range. So here's an example of an IP range they're giving out, 10.254.239.10, all the way through 10.254.239.20. Small 11 IPs, that's what they're handing out. They need to have a matching interface, a physical interface that matches up with that to be able to issue those IPs. So typically you're going to have that already. You just need to know what yours is. To find out what ranges you've got on your server, you can just run IP address or IPA, and you'll get a list of the networks you're connected to. I'm connected to the 10.222.0 network and the 172.16.1 network. So I can hand out IP addresses for either of those ranges. I just need to do the configuration for it.
So where does that configuration need to go?
Okay, so that sample configuration I showed you, that doesn't get read, so it's in the wrong spot. The right spot for it is in /etc/DHCP. So let me jump over to that folder, and looking at it, I can actually see that we've got a dhcpd.conf file right there, so that's the configuration. There's also a dhcpd6.conf, and that's for IPv6's version of DHCP. Now, when somebody's kind of just getting started with IPv6, it's really easy to take our IPv4 knowledge and apply it to IPv6, and that's not always right. This is an example of where that would be wrong. Very few people use DHCP version 6. IPv6 has its own way of doing automatic addressing, and it doesn't require a DHCP server to do it. We usually use router advertisements for that. So it's rare that you'll set up a DHCP server for IPv6, but for IPv4, it's a given, right? So on the exam, you're going to see IPv4 for this one. And that dhcpd.conf file, that's the one that we want. Now, if you look at it, it might actually be just a copy of that example file. And so you might see quite a bit of documentation that's in there, or it might be blank, depending on your distro. Some of them do start out as blank. What I will normally do is take what's in here and just move it to a different file. So I'm going to do a sudo mv dhcpd.conf, and I'm going to move that to dhcpd.conf.bak just to get it out of the way. And then from here, we can do a sudo edit dhcpd.conf, and we can create a nice new blank file that we're just putting in the information that we need and get that kind of in place. So all I really need, like, let me just give you a sample range here. If I want to serve up addresses on the 172.16 network, then I would come in and say subnet 172.16.1.0, that's my network. And then I would say netmask 255.255.255.0, that's the subnet mask for that network. I'll do a curly brace to open up the configuration options inside of this subnet. And then you can either do like double spaces or a tab, whatever makes you happy. And in here, I'll put in my first range. I'll say range. And I'm going to hand out 172.16.1.100 space to 172.16.1.200. So I'm going to hand out 101 IPs. So I put that block in there, throw a semicolon at the end of it because that line is done, and then close that with a curly brace right there. So once all that's in place, now I've defined that range, and the DHCP server knows that it can hand it out, and my config file is a lot easier to read because it just has the block that I need. And I could add my own comments in if I wanted. Maybe this is like a student lab, so I could do a pound symbol to do a comment and say this is my student lab network. And now when I look at this config file in the future, I'll remember what that range is and be able to differentiate it from other things.
So that's pretty simple. Can we kind of do more with this?
Yeah, and you likely will. So I just did the bare minimum right there, right? That's the minimum configuration to make DHCPD happy. But if somebody requests an address right now, they're going to get this address, and then what? Well, they're missing some things. They probably want their default gateway or the router that they talk to. They probably want some name servers, right? There's other options that we want to hand out, but they're exactly what I just said, options. We don't have to have them. But most people expect them. Most computers are going to want those extra things. So some of the other things that we'll add in here, on the range itself, we will usually add a few different values. So I'm going to come through and just do some of them. We'll usually want to advertise out what our net mask is. If we don't advertise a subnet mask, it's going to try and calculate it on its own. It's going to use the old classful boundary. So it would see my 172.16 network and assume it was a class B or 255.255.0.0 network. And that's not what I've got. I've actually got what would be a class C or a 24-bit subnet. So I need to advertise that out so it knows. I'll just say option subnet-mask, and then I'll punch in that subnet mask, and that way I advertise that out to clients when they connect too. And notice I'm doing a semicolon. After each option, I need to do a semicolon so it knows I'm dividing from one to the next. Another option would be the gateway. So I'll say option routers, and then I'll punch in the router that they're going to use. Mine will be 172.16.1.1. That's their default gateway when they want to access other networks. They kind of need to know that, so we'll punch that in. I might do DNS servers. DNS servers are a little bit different because I'll typically have more than one. Usually, like with a gateway, you've only got one. With a subnet, you always have one. But with name servers, we have multiple. So I'll say option domain-name-servers, and then I'll specify each server separated by a comma. So we'll use Google's 8.8.8.8, comma, 8.8.4.4, semicolon. The comma lets it know I'm about to provide multiple values. Semicolon lets me know that it's the end of the list. There's other things we might give out, like a DNS search suffix, right? So if somebody does a search for a single name, what domain do we append to the end of that? We can say option domain-search, and then a name. This one we do have to put in quotes so it knows that it's a text name. I'll do lab.itpro.tv, followed by a semicolon. And so there's like a block of options right there. These are all options that apply to the range. But I might have some options that I apply to the entire server. For example, the lease time. When somebody gets an address, how long is that lease valid? Is it valid for a day, a month, a year? It's up to us and how much our network changes. We usually want it to be something somewhat short. So I might do DHCP leases that are only 8 hours. Well, the DHCP server has default values that are in effect right now. I don't know what they are. They're defaults, right? So it's whatever it is. I might want to override that so I do know what it is. I want it to be 8 hours. Maybe that is the default. I don't know. I'll just hard set it. So I'll go up here to the top of my config file, and I'm going to add a new just comment here. I'll label it as general settings. I'm just doing this so I can remember. I don't have to do that. And then I'll add in a few more things. I'll say default-lease-time, and then how long I want a default lease to be. And this is time in seconds. So if I want it to be 8 hours, how many seconds are in 8 hours? Well, oddly enough, it is 28,800. I did not do that math in my head. I had it written in my notes, but that is 8 hours. And then I might want to set a maximum lease time because people can request a longer lease if they want. So I'll say max-lease time, and maybe I'll set my maximum lease time at 24 hours. So 24 hours is 86,400 seconds. Helps to have a little cheat sheet. And so that's how many seconds that one is. So now I've set those apart. I've got a much more detailed range, and I've got some lease time values that I've adjusted. This is a fairly robust configuration, so it covers the various settings that I need. And now I really look like more of a production-ready DHCP server.
And now that we're all configured, how do we go about starting it up?
Oh, yeah. So now we've got a good configuration, so we should be ready to start it up. Now I'm saying should, and there's a reason for that. On Ubuntu, so if you're on an Ubuntu system like I am, yeah, it's ready to start up. You've got no problem. If you're on Fedora, ready to start up, no problem. But if you're on Red Hat Enterprise Linux, like RHEL 7, RHEL 7 actually has a little bit of an issue where it won't start unless the DHCP database exists. So let me show you how to check that. So I'm going to get out of that configuration file, and I'm going to go into, let's see, it is buried in /var/ /var/ we got to find it now. I got to remember where it is. It is in var/lib. There we go. Hard to remember. /var/lib/dhcp. If you take a look in there, you'll see several files, or maybe it won't. Maybe it'll be empty. You should see a file called dhcpd.leases. And if the service is running, you'll see a second file called dhcpd.leases with a tilde at the end of it, letting you know that it's got a temporary file, right? Because it's actually maintaining the leases in RAM and periodically writing them to disk, and so that's why these files exist. If those files exist, you're ready to start up, not a problem. But on some Linux boxes, those files don't get created automatically. And if the files are missing, you'll get an error when you try to start it up. And if that's the case, all you need to do is sudo touch dhcpd.leases, and that'll create that file, and then the service will start right up. RHEL 8 does that fine, RHEL 7 doesn't. So that's why I just want to mention it here for you out in real life land. But assuming it's all in there, you can do a sudo systemctl enable --now isc-dhcp-server. And when you run that, it's going to turn the service on, and it's going to start it up. There's a chance it's already running. Mine was already running. So I'm going to follow that up with a just double safe sudo systemctl restart ISC DHCP server, and that's going to make sure that it loads all the configuration changes that I made. But at this point, we're up, we're running, we should be in pretty good shape. There's one more thing that might be causing us a problem. If you've got a firewall, it might be blocking DHCP requests. So do a quick check of that. I've got UFW, so let me do a sudo UFW status. I can see that UFW is blocking DHCP, so I need to allow that through. So to do that really quickly, you can just say sudo UFW allow 67/UDP. DHCP uses port 67. It's all UDP. This is all broadcast traffic. So that's going to allow it. And you may need to follow it up also with sudo UFW allow boot PS. And that's the old boot P or the boot protocol that lets you do network boots. They rely on a lot of what DHCP does as well. So I'm going to add that one. With those two rules in place, now we've got it and we're ready to rock it. In fact, when I ran that boot PS, see how it says skipping adding existing rule? So it bumped into what I've already got. And so I am okay. If I take a look at that status, I can see 67 UDP is all that was really added. Now I'll receive DHCP requests and answer back with IPs. I'm up and running.
And are there tools for monitoring DHCP just to make sure that it's working right?
Yeah, there's a few ways. I mean, you could just go to a client and try and connect, right? That's one way, but it requires you exerting effort, right? So there's some things we could do right here on this server. There is an older command that works on some distros. I actually don't think it works on Ubuntu. Let me try it out here, which is sudo dhcpd config test. That's going to take a look at your DHCP configuration and look for errors. Oh, it did actually work. So it did a quick scan. Oh, wow. Glad we scanned this one. I have a typo. And so it helped find that typo right here. Option, I was supposed to type domain-search. I had a mistake. It found it. In a perfect world, I would have run this before starting the DHCP server or restarting it because it likely ran into an error, which I could also check by doing sudo systemctl status isc-dhcp-server. And when I look at it, big red warning right there, failed, right? So we had a problem. It's actually not up and running. It's great for the episode. I didn't do that on purpose. So let's go and fix that real quick. I'll do a sudo edit /etc/dhcp/dhcpd.conf. And I'll go find my mistake right here. Domain search is spelled wrong, so I'll fix that. I'm going to get out of my configuration. I'm going to rerun sudo dhcpd config test, and it's going to run through and check. Looks like everything is good. It says not configured to listen on any interface, but that's okay for what I've got right now. And so it should be ready to start. So I'm going to go and do a sudo systemctl restart isc-dhcp-server. That's going to restart, and we'll take a look at our status. And at this point, we should be up and running. Yes, I can see that it is active and running. Now, I want to point out one real quick thing is I am getting an error. See no subnet declaration for ENP-OS5. That's my network interface. Notice that's the 10.222.0.51 network. Well, I have a range that's 172.16.1. So that's okay. I want to hand out IPs, but for a different interface. So it's connected to the other interface, not this one. So it's just warning, I don't have any subnets that match that interface, and that's okay. So some of these errors you can ignore. Some are a little more important than others, but you can read through here. And also, depending on what network configuration software you're using, it might not be able to see that you've got a static address when you do, so you might see messages there as well. But a lot of those are able to be disregarded. Just read through and check, and if there's something really critical, you'll see it, especially if the service doesn't start like mine didn't originally.
Well, that's awesome. And in this episode, we were able to look at quite a bit, including a typo that you say was unintentional, but I think you did that on purpose. We got to look at installing and configuring a DHCP server on Linux. We got to look at creating and activating a DHCP address pool. And Don showed us how to monitor DHCP and make sure that it's working correctly. But don't go away. We've got more LPIC coming up in the next episode. We'll see you next time.
Thank you for watching IT Pro TV.
A DHCP server can actually address more than one network. In this episode, learn how to configure multiple subnets with DHCP.
You're watching IT Pro TV.
Welcome back. I'm here with Dawn for more on DHCP. In this episode, we'll talk about configuring multiple subnets. So Dawn, can you give us kind of an overview of what we'll talk about today?
Sure. A DHCP server can be really powerful. It can serve up addresses on a single network, or it can do multiple networks. So in this episode, we're going to see how to set that up and show you how a DHCP server keeps things straight, because when people connect, it's got to figure out which address to issue. We'll also talk a little bit about DHCP reservations, which are exceptions to the rule, and let us kind of bend the way a DHCP server works to our needs. So pretty cool stuff, a little bit more advanced functionality inside of DHCP.
Now, how is a DHCP server that hosts multiple subnets any different than a normal one?
All right, so it has a little more work to do, right? You have to think about how a DHCP client works. When you boot up your laptop or you break out your cell phone and connect to a wireless network, it doesn't have an address. It doesn't know what network is being used. It doesn't know IPs, subnet masks, DNS servers, doesn't know anything. And so with DHCP, it's shouting out to the world and saying, hey, can somebody help me? But it can't even really talk to a DHCP server because it doesn't know the address of the server. So it's doing a true broadcast. It's broadcasting to, on IPv4, it's 255.255.255.255, just an address that hits everybody on the network. And then a DHCP server hears that. And when it hears it, it's ready to respond back and give a person an address. But what does it know about that person connecting? Nothing. It knows absolutely nothing because that client doesn't have a layer 3 address. It does have a MAC address, a media access control address that's burned into every network adapter. So it's got that. That lets us know it's a unique machine, but it doesn't let us know anything about what identity that machine wants to have. So the DHCP server has to make a decision. How do I figure out what address to give it? And on a DHCP server with only one address range, that's easy. It's only got one pool. So it just grabs the next address in line and hands that to the client, and that's it. But when there's more than one network involved, things get a little bit dicey. Now the DHCP server has to figure it out. Like, well, do I pull from range number 1, or do I pull from range number 2, or range number 10? It has to make a decision. So there's a little bit more logic involved, and that's really the tricky part that differentiates a DHCP server on more than one network versus one that's just on a single network.
So if a DHCP server does have more than one subnet, how does it know which one to assign a client to?
Well, it can't trust what the client's giving it, right? Because MAC addresses don't mean much to it other than uniqueness. And there's nothing else that identifies that client. So it can't rely on anything from the client. It has to make the decision on its own. And it actually does it through a really neat way. On your server, if you're connected to multiple networks, you've got multiple network adapters. And on those network adapters, you have IP addresses. Now, on a DHCP server, it's really important that you use static IP addresses, not DHCP. You don't want your DHCP server using DHCP itself. That is a recipe for disaster. So you need static IPs. And that means that the DHCP server can just look at those network cards and say, what addresses do I have? And if it hears a client request come in on network adapter 1, it can give it an address that matches the network on network adapter 1. And if it hears a request come in on network adapter 2, it can give that client an address that matches the network on network adapter number 2. So you just need multiple network adapters. If you've got 2 networks, that's easy. Most servers have 2 network adapters in them anyway. Or you can always add a second adapter. They're cheap. But if you've got 100 networks, now things get a little bit crazy. Well, that's where you can leverage things like VLANs, or virtual local area networks, and VLAN trunking. If you've taken any of a Cisco training or really any advanced network training, you've learned about 802.1q tunneling and trunks. That with those, you can have many, many virtual networks attached to one physical adapter. And now your DHCP server could be servicing hundreds of networks. And as it hears people connect, it knows which virtual adapter they connected on and gives them the appropriate address. So that's really the thing that we need. If we're going to support multiple networks, we either need multiple physical or virtual network adapters, and they each need to have a unique static IP address in the different subnets that we're going to be handing out. And that's how the server will know which address to give to which people.
That seems like a relatively simple solution to a pretty complex problem. So what does this look like in our configuration?
All right, well, there's 2 pieces to this. So one piece is making sure that we have static IP addresses, right? And that can actually be a little bit tricky because so many distros are going different ways with how they do configurations. On Red Hat-based systems, we've got the network manager, so you might have to go into NMCLI. On Debian-based ones, we have NetPlan now, so you have to go into a NetPlan configuration. But whatever it is, you need to get static IP addresses assigned to your interfaces. And if we take a look at my server, so I'm on Ubuntu 20.04, and I'm using NetPlan. So here, let me pull up my configuration for you. And I'm going to go into IPA, and I'll just pull up my IP addresses, or we can make this brief, -BRA, there we go. And I can see I've got two adapters. So I've got ENP0S5 and ENP0S6, and they each have addresses. One of them is 10.222.0.51, and the other is 172.16.1.51. Those are the two networks that I've got, and so I can create ranges for those two. If I create subnets for any other networks, they won't work. I won't be able to hand those out. I'm only able to hand out ranges that match up to these two subnets. So that's kind of the first stage of doing the configuration. Then the second part is to go into DHCP's configuration and add the second range. So let me do that. I'll do a sudo edit /etc/dhcp/dhcpd.conf. And I've got one network that I created, which was in the last episode for the student lab network. So that's the 172.16.1 network. But I'm also connected to the 10.2222 network, which is the IT Pro TV Studios. So maybe I'll add another entry in here. I'm just going to do a hashtag, and I'll say this is the IT Pro TV Studios. So that's just a little comment line, totally optional. And I'm going to add a new subnet. I'll say subnet 10.222.0.0 netmask, whoops, got to spell it right, netmask 255.255.255.0. I'll open that with a curly brace, and I'm just going to do the minimum, which is specifying the range. So I'll do 10.222.0.100 through 10.222.0.200, semicolon, and then I'll close out that brace. So right there is kind of the bare minimum. I mean, I would probably add a router just to make this actually work. But once that's there, now I've got the range. And looking at it, 172.16.1.0, that matches my, I think it was my second network adapter, and 10.222.0 matches my first network adapter. I don't have to put the network adapter names in, right? Because I can't remember them mostly, but the ENP0S5, I'm making up letters now. So whatever they were, that doesn't matter, because the DHCP server itself will be able to figure it out, right? It uses the kernel APIs in Linux to be able to look and see which addresses are on which adapters, and then it just matches them up. And you might have more than one adapter in the same subnet. It's not very common, but maybe you've got some kind of multipathing or redundancy or whatever. If you're doing something like that, it can map one subnet to more than one interface and serve out of that same subnet or same address pool to each one. So that functionality is all just baked right in. It's going to pick all this up, read it, and service these addresses without us having to really do much. In fact, all I have to do once I get out of this file is to restart the DHCP server, and now I'm handing out multiple addresses.
Well, this all looks good to me, but how do we know for sure if it's working correctly?
So there's a few ways to check and see if it's working. Easiest way is really take a couple of clients and test, right? So if they jump on the network and get addresses, then you should see it. If you're on a busy network, it's probably already happening. And so you can just go and look at your lease file and find out there. Let me show you how I would check. I'm going to get out of this config, and I'll do a sudo systemctl restart isc-dhcp-server. So I'm going to restart it so that it loads its configuration file. It does not load the configuration file automatically. We've got to do that restart. So now it's loaded it, and in theory, I'm serving addresses on these two interfaces. All right, how do I know that? Well, I could do a systemctl status isc-dhcp server to look at the status. It should be running and happy, and I should be able to look at the listening side of things, and I should see listen statements. I'm listening and sending on my 172.16.1 interface, and down a little bit further, I can see I'm listening and sending on my 10.222.0 interface. So that's good. That's a healthy DHCP server. That's what I want to see right there. I don't see any errors. I know that it matched them up. In the last episode, we had an error where it didn't match up because we only had one of those ranges defined. Now that I've got them both, they all match. Good, clean, checks out. Probably okay. I have to say probably okay because everything looks okay here on the server, but maybe there's still something wrong where the clients aren't able to connect. Maybe it's being blocked by a firewall or something like that. So the way to be absolutely double super sure is to go and look at your DHCP database. If I go into /var/lib/DHCP and take a look in there, that's where that dhcpd.leases file is, and it's just a text file. You can type less dhcpd.leases and open it up and take a look. Now, as clients start requesting addresses, their MAC address is going to get mapped to their IP address, and we'll see them right here in the list. So if you start to see this populating, that's how you know it's actually working. You can see the leases being built up right in here. You can follow the file if you want, and then as people connect, you'll see it output on your screen. It's up to you how you want to view it, but it's a few different ways. Now, if I check these things, if no addresses are showing up here and I'm not really getting good output on the systemctl status command, my next step in troubleshooting would be to go to journalctl. If you do journalctl-u, you can view all of the log data for a particular unit. And I want to view isc-dhcp-server. And when I run that, I can pull up all of the log entries all the way back to when this service was first installed. And so this is where I'm starting to see some of the errors that were from the previous episode when I didn't have a subnet defined. But here I can spot those errors, look at it, try and figure out what's going wrong. You know, here where it's telling me not configured to listen on any interface, it's letting me know I've got a mismatch. But afterwards, we configured it properly and restarted it, and so we'll see those errors go away right about there, and that's where things become healthy and happy. Right there is where we restarted it, and now it's error-free. But if there were more errors, this is where I could go and view those and learn a little bit more about what's going on. So a couple of different ways to monitor it and really just make sure it's working the way it's supposed to.
Now, one thing that we haven't really talked about yet are static IP mappings. So how do those work with multiple subnets?
All right, so static mappings, or sometimes they're called DHCP reservations. DHCP reservations break all the rules. They allow us to tie a particular IP address to a particular MAC address. And the DHCP server doesn't care what network adapter they're on. It doesn't look at the various pools. It doesn't look at the IPs on your interfaces. It just cares about the MAC address. So it's watching for those MAC addresses, and when it finds a particular one, it maps it to an IP address. So that is a static IP reservation or a DHCP reservation, and they're pretty easy to create, but it's just a little bit of a weird syntax. Let me get back into my configuration. I'll do sudo edit /etc/dhcp/dhcpd.conf. All right. Looking at it here, I can see each of the subnets I've defined. And see how the very first keyword is subnet? That's how I'm telling the DHCP server I'm defining a pool, a whole subnet, a range of addresses. But there is another keyword, which is host. Now I'm telling it I'm configuring one specific host, a single entity that I want to put in there. And so I would come through and define those hosts and set up what I want that mapping to be look like. So here, let me do one. I'll create one for like my laptop. So I'll just say this is Don's laptop. And I'll punch in a static mapping for it. So the first thing I do is I say host, and then I need to give it a name. This name is not actually used. So it's not applied to the client. The system doesn't even really care about the name, but it has to be unique. I can't use the same name twice. So this is just how it's telling each reservation apart. I'm going to call mine Don-laptop. So that will be my host name. And then I'll do a curly brace to open up the configuration. And inside of that, it's very similar to what we're handing out up top. In fact, I can copy and paste a lot of this stuff. If I want to hand a lot of these settings out and make them the same for that host, I can do that. So I'm going to copy all of those options from up top. And then, whoops, let me do that. And then I'll come down here and I'm just going to paste those in. And my tab's got a little out of whack, but I can fix that so that it's got all the various options that'll apply to this client. I want it to have the same thing, so I'll do a curly brace to close that, and there's the options that'll apply to me. But it still doesn't know that it's me, and it doesn't know what address I want to use. So I need to do a little bit more in here. So the first option I'm going to specify is hardware, Ethernet, and then what the MAC address is, the media access control address. Now, I'm going to pull up another tab here on my laptop and just do an IP ADDR. And so I've got Ethernet 0, which is on the wrong network. Oh, actually here I got Ethernet 1. Ethernet 1 is here with no address, so it needs a DHCP address. And as I look at the output for that command, I can find the MAC address right here. So it's listed, that hardware address. It's a 48-bit hexadecimal number. It's separated with regular colons. So I can see mine is this 00:1C and so on. I'm going to copy that. And back in my configuration, I'm going to paste that in. So it says hardware, Ethernet, and then my MAC address written just like I saw. And I'll do a semicolon. And then on the next line, I will say fixed -address and what IP I want it to have. Maybe I want mine to be 172.16.1.222. Now, that 222 is not in the address range that I created up here, right? Up here, I created a range that was 100 to 200. Well, DHCP reservations break all the rules. They let you kind of do whatever you want. I can pick an address that's outside of the pool. I'm effectively creating a micro pool, one that is just available for my particular client. And all of these other options and things, I don't have to have these. If I leave them out, it'll actually pull them from a pool if the address is in the pool. Since my address is out of the pool, I need to provide those other values so that I get the right settings. But right there, I've got my MAC address mapped to an IP address. So now when my laptop connects, that's the address that it's going to get. And it won't matter what interface I'm on. It's just looking for that hardware address in order to do that matching. So that's how we do a static reservation.
Wow, a lot of great information on DHCP servers in this episode. We were able to talk about the difference between a normal DHCP server and one that can host multiple subnets. We talked about assigning client addresses, and as you just showed us, which was so kind of you, you showed us how static IP mappings work with multiple subnets. So this is all we have for DHCP, but stick around. We've got more LPIC coming up. We'll see you next time.
Thank you for watching IT Pro TV.
If you need a centralized user account database for Linux, OpenLDAP may just fit the bill. Stay tuned.
You're watching IT Pro TV.
Welcome back. I'm your host, Sophie, and I'm here with Dawn for more LPIC. And today we begin our journey into OpenLDAP. So can you kind of give us an overview of what we're going to talk about in this episode?
Sure. We're going to have several episodes on OpenLDAP, but in this one, we're going to focus on getting an OpenLDAP server built up. So we'll start with a little overview of what it is. We'll go through the process of getting it installed and talk about some of the challenges we run into when it comes to managing OpenLDAP. But by the end of the episode, we will have an OpenLDAP server up and running.
So for starters, what is OpenLDAP and why would we want to use it?
All right. Well, OpenLDAP, well, let's just start with the name, right? So open, it's an open source project. So this is something that's freely available for anybody to use. And then LDAP. LDAP is the Lightweight Directory Access Protocol. Now, that name is a little misleading for what we're going to be using in here with OpenLDAP. LDAP itself is a protocol for accessing a directory. That's what the name implies, right? Well, a directory is a database. And that database can store any number of types of objects in it. It can have user accounts, computer accounts, folders, email addresses, contacts, you name it. It's a database. And like any database, it maintains a schema, and the schema defines the objects that are in it. Well, this is an open source project, so it's fully customizable. You can put whatever objects you want in there. You want to catalog your DVD collection? Fine. Oh, not DVDs anymore. Now I'm dating myself. So like a Blu-ray or Red-Ray or whatever we got today. If you want to catalog that, you can fire up OpenLDAP and do that. At the end of the day, it is a database. But it's designed to be accessed with LDAP, the Lightweight Directory Access Protocol. Now, while we could use it for just about anything, the number one use for OpenLDAP is user authentication. And so like if we pull up their webpage, I've got their webpage pulled up right here. So it's openldap.org. OpenLDAP is included with almost all Linux distributions. It's not usually installed by default. We've got to install it. But once we have it, we can bring it up and get it going pretty straightforward. But when you look at their page, a lot of their documentation will talk about user authentication because that's the primary use for it. We can create users and groups. We can put them into organizational units. We can even assign permissions and use that to create a centralized user directory for our Linux systems. In the Microsoft world, you have Microsoft's Active Directory. OpenLDAP would be like the equivalent of that for Linux-based systems. Now, you will see a few different names used for it, and one of the funnier ones that we'll actually see quite a bit is slapd, or some people call it slapped. but it's slapd, which is the standalone LDAP daemon. That's the actual server that will be up and running on our system. So OpenLDAP is the project, but slapd is the actual binary that's going to power a lot of this that we'll need up and running in the background. But that's all kind of the key components of what OpenLDAP is, and we're going to be using it as a user directory.
So it's basically a database, and database setups can be pretty complicated. So what's the damage with OpenLDAP? How bad is it?
Well, for once, this one's actually pretty simple to get up and going. Normally when you have a database, you've got to worry about indexes and transaction log files and backup strategies and all this other crazy stuff. Even, like I mentioned, the schema a moment ago, defining table layouts. That is a nightmare in a lot of databases. But OpenLDAP, because it's designed for user authentication right from the beginning, we can get it installed and have it up and going with minimal to no configuration. In fact, here, I'll show you the basic process. If I want to get it installed and up and running, I need to do a sudo apt install, and I just need 2 packages. The first package is the important one, slapd, right? So I need that one. And then the second package is ldap-utils, and technically that's an optional package. If I intend to work with the OpenLDAP server, though, I'm going to need those utilities, so I've got to have it. So when I run that, it's going to find those packages. There's a few other things that are going to come along with it. This SASL2 or SASL2 is kind of an important one. We'll talk about it in another episode. But it's going to get piggybacked along, but not much else. And that's because this is designed to be a standalone server, a very simple, easy to implement thing. And when I say yes like that, that's going to get it installed. It's going to ask me one simple question. In this directory, we're going to have an administrator. What do you want their password to be? And I get to pick. And honestly, it's not even all that important what we put here because we're going to overwrite it in a minute. But I'll just punch in my ultra secure password 123. So that's going to be my password. Obviously, you'd want to pick something a little more secure than that. I'm going to give it the password, and then it's going to ask me, oh, my configuration is invalid. Make sure my domain name is syntactically, whoops, let me go back to that. Punch in my password again. Sorry, I must not have typed the same password twice. There we go. And now it runs through with the installation, and that's it. OpenLDAP is now up and running. I've got an administrator account. I'm in business.
So that's it. It's up and running. We don't need to do anything with the configuration or anything like that?
Well, technically, no. So like if I come in, and I'll use one of my utilities here, if I want to view the configuration of OpenLDAP as it's sitting right now, there's kind of a funny command, which is slapcat. And so I can just run sudo slapcat, and it's not slapping a cat. Slap, we already know, is the standalone LDAP daemon. But then cat is like the cat command to export a file to our screen, right? So I want to see that file. When I run slapcat, it outputs that configuration, and I can see I've got a very basic configuration in place. It all fits right here on one screen. Maybe I have 2 lines off the top, right? So I can see I've got an organization that's called no domain. I've got a DC is set to no domain. I've got a couple other things here. My distinguished name is admin at no domain. It's not an ideal configuration. So technically, going back to your question, Sophie, it is up and running. We could use it like this, but we're probably going to want to go and change a lot of this stuff. At a minimum, we need to change that domain name because that's just annoying. But otherwise, it is technically up and running.
So if we do want to change the default configuration, where would that be stored?
All right, so there's a couple of different ways we can do the configuration depending on the level of pain you're ready to accept, right? If you're really just into making your life difficult, you can go in and modify LDAP's or OpenLDAP's configuration using the configuration files. They are stored inside of /etc/LDAP. So if I go into /etc/LDAP, I'll see a file right there, ldap.conf. That's the main configuration file. And if I take a look at it, it will contain the configuration. However, it's not very well documented. In fact, it's barely documented at all. And it only shows the options that override the default config. So looking at mine is almost entirely blank. In fact, almost every line is commented out except the last one where it's got a TLS certificate authority defined. So that's it. I don't see all the other options. So this is where I talk about the pain. Like, we have to know the things to come in and type in and get that set up. And most of us, honestly, we just don't know those things. So to help with that, there is actually a nice guided configuration we can go through to get OpenLDAP up and running even better. So to run that, what we're going to do is type sudo dpkg, so we're calling the Debian package manager, dpkg dash reconfigure slap d. All right. This is going to go through the reconfiguration, and it will give us a guided menu. We answer, I think it's 7 or 8 questions, and when we're done, OpenLDAP will be running the way that we want it to. So I'm just going to press enter on that, and I get this nice little guided menu. The first thing is asking, do I want to draw in the existing configuration or just throw it out and start from scratch? I usually just say no on this. Don't throw it out. Just keep what's there and let me go and update it. That's way, if I run this more than once, I'm not having to redo every single setting. Since this is a new server, it doesn't really matter which one I pick. I'm just going to say no. Then a domain name. I don't want no domain. My domain name is going to be lab.itpro.tv. It needs to be a DNS valid domain name. It doesn't have to be 3 levels like mine is. It could be 2. I could just do itpro.tv, but that overlaps with the website. So I just want it to be lab.itpro.tv. You would put in whatever your domain name is going to be. Then an organization name. I want my organization to be itpro.tv. So I'll just punch that one in. And I'm doing capital letters here. You can do all lowercase. There are some LDAP diehards that insist you do lowercase for everything, but the secret they don't tell you, it allows uppercase. You can do it. It's okay to make things look pretty once in a while. So I'll do that here. I'm going to give you my capital letters. Now I get to re-enter the administrator password. You always have to punch this one in, and that's why I said it didn't really matter what I put earlier, because I'm going to overwrite it right here with my new password, which I'm actually just going to do the same thing. Then it asks, if I ever uninstall slapd, do I want to remove the database when I do the uninstall? Otherwise, it'll leave the database behind. That can be a little bit of a security concern. So some people prefer to have that removed at the same time. Personally, I don't, because there may be times where a binary becomes corrupt. And I just want to quickly uninstall and reinstall the package without losing my database. So I usually say no to this. That is the default. If I'm decommissioning a server, the hard drives are going to get erased anyway, so I'm not really worried about leaving that database behind. Then it sees that I already have a database from the initial installation, so it's asking if it's okay to move that somewhere else. Otherwise, there's going to be a conflict. I need to say yes to this to get that old database out of the way. Once that's done, now it's placed a configuration in there that's a little more meaningful to me. And if I run sudo slapcat again, I can pull that configuration up, and now instead of seeing no domain plastered all over the place, I can see lab itpro TV. I can see the admin account's been switched over to that. My organization is itpro TV. Now things are configured, and now we've actually got a server that's pretty much ready to go.
Now, you also mentioned PHP LDAP admin. So was that installed alongside OpenLDAP?
Yeah, we were talking about that earlier. When we deal with OpenLDAP from the command line, it can be kind of a pain. So far, it hasn't been bad, right? But you'll see, like in the next episode, working in the command line can be really, really challenging because a lot of syntax is written in this LDAP format. So it's very, very difficult to go through and know all the right parameters and not get a typo and so on. So there is a kind of a graphical user interface that's available for OpenLDAP. It's a web-based utility that lets you kind of graphically manage this directory, and it's way easier than trying to do it from the command line. The most popular one is called PHP LDAP admin. It's open source, and it's included in, I think, just about every distro's repository, so it's quick and easy to get set up and going. If you want to learn more about their project, their webpage is phpldappadmin.sourceforge.net. It's an open source project. They tell you all about it on their page, but we don't have to go and download it from the page. We can use the documentation there if we want, but just downloading it and installing it is really, really straightforward. So let me get over to my command prompt, and I'll show you how to do that. So the first thing that I need to do is to get it installed. So I'll say sudo apt install php ldap admin. And when I run that, it's going to find the packages. Notice it's pulling along Apache 2, right? We need a web server to power this thing, so it's going to bring down Apache. If you already have Apache running, we're going to have a conflict, right? This needs the web pages for it. So I'll show how to override that here in a minute. I'm going to go ahead and say yes to that and let it go ahead and install. Actually, when we install Apache, it has a default website that comes along with it, so we'll conflict with that either way. So I guess we're always going to have a conflict here. But once it's installed, I'm going to turn off the default website so we don't have a conflict anymore. But now that it's installed, I can go in and I can modify its configuration. So I'm going to do a sudo edit /etc/php ldap admin /config.php. And that's the configuration file. The configuration file has a lot of stuff in it. If you just start scrolling down and looking for settings, it's going to take you a while. So what I normally do is when I jump right in, the first thing I do is I search for the word name in between single ticks. So I'm just going to do the little single quote mark name, and I'm going to look for that. And that's going to take me to this section. The section is actually titled Define Your LDAP Servers in this section. So this is where we're supposed to tell it where to find our LDAP server. And there's a few values in here that we need to change. The first one is the server name, and this is just a graphical name. If you're managing 5 different servers, I can give them 5 different names so I know which one I'm connected to. I'm just going to rename this one. My server actually is called directory-server, so that's what I'll call it here. This doesn't actually have to match the real name. Again, this is just a visual element for us. And then if you keep scrolling down, you'll see more options like what's the IP address of the server? Well, the server I'm managing is 10.222.0.53, so I'll punch that in. You can do a DNS name here, but when you're connecting to a web interface like this, you never quite know if DNS is going to be fully set up right to be able to access it, so an IP address is a little bit safer. Then I'll see what is my base server base name. So whenever I do a lookup for a user or whatever, effectively what's the domain name? And I have to put the domain name in the format that LDAP expects it to be. So everything has this kind of a name, which will be broken up into individual pieces. Mine is lab.itpro.tv. So I have to do DC equals lab, comma, DC equals itpro, comma, DC equals TV. So those DCs are kind of taking the place of what a dot normally would be. And I'm going to copy that because we're going to need that a few different places here in the file. So once I've got that, I can scroll down a little bit further. We've got our login type. We want session-based logins. That's fine. And then the directory that I'm binding to. When I bind, I'm logging in with an account. And the default admin account is actually called admin. The full name is administrator, but the username itself when we log in is just admin. And so you can see mine is set to admin, but then it's got that DC example and so on. I'm going to go ahead and delete that out, and I will paste that in. If I had more than one account, I could specify them. I've only got one. That next line is commented out, so I'll just ignore that one and skip past it. And then that's it for what we need to connect to the server. There is one more change I would recommend that you make in here. When you create user accounts in OpenLDAP, by default, it has to give them a user ID. OpenLDAP is supposed to be a centralized database, and I don't want duplicate user IDs on my network. Well, every Linux machine has local accounts, and those local accounts will normally start at like 500 or 1,000 for the user IDs, and I don't want to duplicate that. So I like to modify OpenLDAP so that I use user IDs that are high enough that they don't bump into local users. Now, when we create things via the command line, we specify the user ID, so we can solve that problem. But with PHP LDAP admin, we can actually set it up in here by setting a kind of an array that keeps track of that. And as you scroll down, you'll find a number of places in here where it starts referring to that count. It's the auto number section. So yeah, we've got auto number. That's where it says we're going to auto number user counts, just increment by 1 each time. But if you keep scrolling down, you'll see where you can define a minimum and a maximum and so on, and kind of define that range. I don't usually worry about a maximum because who knows how many user counts I'll have, but I definitely worry about a minimum. I typically set mine to start at around 10,000. I know 10,000 is way higher than what any other distro is using for local user accounts, and so that's going to save me some trouble there. So I need to find, it's somewhere in here, the minimum array. I'm going to, I'll just search for min with single tick marks around it. There we go. So here is that value, and it is, it's commented out. You know what? Here, let's just copy that. I'm just going to copy and paste. We'll get a little creative on this one. So I'm going to copy that line, and I'll go back up to where we defined all of our server settings, and I'll just throw it in there so that way it's nearby the rest of my configuration, and I kind of find it all in one place. So here's the rest of my configuration that we were working on a moment ago, and I will just paste that in here and see how it's not commented out anymore. So now it's lit up for me. And I'm going to change these numbers. I'm going to set the UID number to start at 10,000, and I'll set the GID to start at 10,000 as well. So now groups and users will definitely be well beyond what a local user would have. I'll go ahead and save that. And now we've got a good configuration in place. I just need to disable Apache's default website. I'll do sudo a2d dis. I'm disabling a site, and the site is called 000-default.conf. That's going to turn off that default one. And once that's done, I just need to restart Apache. So I'll do sudo systemctl restart Apache 2. That'll restart it. And now we've got a web GUI set up for OpenLDAP.
Now, do we need to allow OpenLDAP through our firewall?
Oh, we do. Yeah, absolutely. Now we need to allow OpenLDAP, and we need to allow PHP LDAP admin through the firewall if we want remote access. That's easy enough. I'm using UFW, so I can say sudo UFW allow. It has an alias for OpenLDAP, so I can actually just type LDAP, and that'll allow it. But if you need to do it manually, LDAP uses TCP port 389. So we just need to allow 389. That's all it needs, really simple, and that's going to allow that connectivity. For my web interface, I need to do sudo UFW allow HTTP and HTTPS, which is port 80 and 443. Depending on, maybe I just want 443. It's up to me, however I want to set that up. But that'll get it through the firewall, and so now it's available to use. Now, we haven't actually used it yet. I want you to stay tuned because in the next episode, we're going to actually get in and start creating objects and so on inside of OpenLDAP.
So today we got to look at kind of an introduction to OpenLDAP. I know we're not quite done with it, but we also got to look at installing and configuring slapd. I love these acronyms. And PHP LDAP admin, which is a long one. And then as you just showed us how to allow OpenLDAP through a firewall. But like I said, we're not quite done. We've got a couple more episodes on OpenLDAP, so definitely stick around if you want to know more. Stay tuned and we'll see you next time.
Thank you for watching IT Pro TV.
So you just brought up an OpenLDAP server, but now you need to actually put stuff in it. In this episode, we'll show you how it's done.
You're watching IT Pro TV.
Welcome back. I'm here with Dawn for more LPIC, and if you've been following along, you know we touched a little bit on OpenLDAP, and we're going to continue with that today with managing objects in OpenLDAP. So what exactly are we going to talk about in this episode?
Well, it doesn't necessarily sound all that exciting. We're going to create stuff in the database, but it's super important. The bulk of our time is going to be spent populating a database. So in this episode, we'll talk about some of the things that we can populate OpenLDAP with. What are the objects that we put in there? Then we'll see some of the ways that we can do it. We'll go an easy way and go the command line, and then we'll talk about some of the easier ways that might be out there that can help you with getting all of your data objects entered into OpenLDAP.
So can you give us some examples of some objects that we might want to create in OpenLDAP?
Sure. So in a default install of OpenLDAP, it is already set up to receive things like user accounts, right, which we need for authentication. You can define computers, which are great for doing things like asset tracking. You track the serial numbers and other things. They can be loaded in as objects. You can use organizational units, which are like folders, so we can organize everybody in certain ways. Maybe you have a multinational company, and so you want your users divided up by what country they're in. Or you have departments, and so you want a marketing folder, and all of your users for marketing are in that folder. Well, that's an organizational unit. You can create groups, which are grouping users together for assigning permissions. We might say anybody who wants to be able to print to this printer needs to be in a particular group, so we could create that. You can actually do more mundane things like email address directories. If I want a global address list for my company, I could define everybody's email address inside of OpenLDAP and then query that to generate an email list for the company. We can do the same thing with contacts for people outside of our company. You can create those and populate them. There's really not a limit to the things we can do. I've seen some people get really creative. If you modify the schema for the OpenLDAP database, you can have it store anything. I've seen people where they store entire sets of DNS zones in there, so their DNS servers are being fed out of OpenLDAP. Little crazy for my liking. I like DNS servers to be nice and stable, but you can do it. You don't have a limit. But the main things that you're going to see people work with are things like users, right? So those are pretty important as far as objects are concerned. There's also going to be organizational units. That's a big one. And then groups, those three. And so in this episode, we're going to show how to create all three of those. There are a few other things that you might see. And let me just go to my command prompt here. When I do a sudo slapcat and pull up my default configuration, you'll notice that most things in OpenLDAP have like a 2-letter abbreviation. And so when I look at a name like this, admin lab IT Pro TV. Now, I would know this user as admin at lab.itpro.tv, right? Like an email address. But these abbreviations are telling me the LDAP equivalent. So when you see something like CN, that's a common name. So the common name for this user is admin. And then they have a domain component, or a DC. And this one has 3 domain components, lab.itpro.tv. So really the hardest part of creating objects in LDAP is just knowing which abbreviations to use for which thing. You'll see other entries in here like, let's see, that's DC. Somewhere in here we'll see O, right here. O for organization. So my organization is called IT Pro TV. Easy to mix up with OU, which is an organizational unit. So, slight difference. You might see UID for various things, for user IDs. I have an entry UUID, a universally unique identifier, or you might just have a unique identifier, UID. So these are all little things that you'll see. And when it comes time to populate the database, you've got to know which of these values, which of these properties you're filling out for that object. That's really the tricky part. But aside from that, you can put darn near anything you want inside of OpenLDAP.
Now, how do we go about creating these objects? I mean, is this going to be pretty command line heavy?
It can be. By default, it is. Yeah, if I want to start creating something. So I mentioned OUs, right? If I want to create organizational units to organize my users, well, I've got to think about, first off, what OUs I want. Maybe I want marketing and sales and so on. Or maybe I want users and computers. That's like the Microsoft way. You can do it various ways. You have to think about that organization. And then you create a text file that defines what you want to do. Those text files are formatted in a particular way. It's called the LDAP Data Interchange Format, or LDIF. And LDIF files basically contain instructions. They say, we're adding these records, we're removing these records, or we're modifying these records. So we say what action we're taking, and then we tell it what we're doing. And we put all that into a text file, and then we just import that into OpenLDAP. And it kind of executes it. It reads through that file and does whatever we tell it to do. And one file could contain thousands of instructions. I'll give you an example. There's a university here in town where every fall they admit some 30,000 new freshmen. Just they know that's going to happen. And they generate LDIF files that contain tens of thousands of students so they can import them all at once with all the appropriate properties and so on. Now they've got it in that database and they go. So creating the file is, maybe you're doing it in a text editor or somewhere else, outputting from another database somewhere, so that makes it a little easier. And then on the command line, we're just having to import that in. So it's not so bad.
So where would we start? What would be the first object that we would create in a brand new OpenLDAP directory?
All right, for me, when it's a brand new OpenLDAP directory, the first thing I'm creating are organizational units. I want folders in place to be able to put the objects in. So I've got an example of what that would look like. Let me edit this. So I've got a file. I just called it ou.ldiff. Traditionally, you'll put ldiff as the extension, but it doesn't have to be. You can call it whatever you want. But the format of the file is kind of important. The minimum thing we need to create organizational units are 3 values. We need a distinguished name. So what is going to identify that organizational unit? We need the object class that defines what type of object this is. And then we need a name for the organizational unit. So I start off with DN, and the distinguished name, like the full name for this item, I'm creating an OU called users. And so this is going to be OU equals users, comma, and then the domain components, lab, IT Pro, TV. So DC equals lab, DC equals IT Pro, DC equals TV. The object class is organizational unit. And notice they use camel case. In LDAP, I don't know why, but for whatever reason, they chose to use camel case for their syntax. So you'll see the first letter of organizational is lowercase, but then the first letter of any additional words will be in uppercase. So that's why it's kind of written in a weird casing, but that's the syntax that they use. And then the OU's actual name is just users. And almost always, these two are going to match, right? It's extremely rare for those not to match. So the OU is called users, and the distinguished name maps that to the domain. I've got a second one down here called groups. I'm creating another OU where I want to store my groups. And so this one is an organizational unit. It just happens to be called groups. Maybe I want to create another one that is going to be called computers, right? So I could just come down here, add in another entry. I'm just going to copy and paste to save some time, and I'll change groups to computers. And so now I will add that one in. If you've ever worked with Microsoft's Active Directory, the users and computers OUs are kind of like the default ones, so we can put those in. You can do capital letters for the names if you want. You don't have to. Many people prefer lowercase. But each of these is defining an OU. And now I can save that file, and I can import that into OpenLDAP. Now this command is a little bit long, but it's not that bad. I'm going to say sudo LDAP add. So this is a tool that's installed with the LDAP utils package. So we installed that in the last episode. So I'll say LDAP add dash lowercase x. I'm telling it I need to do simple authentication or interactive authentication. So I'll have to provide it a username and a password. I'll do dash D, which is telling it the distinguished name I'm going to log in with. I'm going to log in with CN equals admin, DC equals lab, DC equals IT pro, DC equals TV. That's the administrator account that was created automatically for us in the last episode. Then I need to tell it that I'm going to have to prompt for a password. So I'll do dash capital W for prompt for a password, followed by dash lowercase f. Here's the file I want you to import. And mine is called ou.ldif. So that's going to tell it to read that file, authenticate as the admin user, and import that into OpenLDAP. So it's going to prompt for my password. I'll punch that in, and then off it goes. Hopefully we don't get any errors. So I'm just looking at it here. I can see that the object class value number 0 provided more than once. That should be okay. It added the user's entry. Let me, possible missing new line. Looks like I had a little typo there for users. So let me see what actually made it in. I'll do a sudo slapcat. The nice thing is when you do an import, whatever you added shows up right there at the end of the file. So when I run that, I can immediately see what was brought in or what wasn't brought in. And so when I take a look at it, I can see that it actually failed to import. So I need to fix my typo, and then we'll be able to import. And it's probably because I copied and pasted. Sometimes you get a bad like carriage return or whatever, and the file will get a little bit upset about that. So let me go back into my file here, and I'm just going to double check and make sure I don't have any stray. I do have some stray values. I got some extra spaces in here. It's very sensitive to that. So I'm just checking the ends of my lines to make sure I don't have any of those extra spaces because it assumes that's going to be a value, and then it's not able to map that to anything. So there we go. That should be good. And I got one empty right there. All right, so let me get all that out. And once we've got that nice and clean, I can rerun my import command. I can punch in the password value. That's what I want to see right there. New entries brought in users, groups, and computers. I can run sudo slapcat. And now I see those OUs right there, all created, good to go.
And now that we have our kind of organization set up, I would imagine it's time to create user accounts. So what attributes do we need for that?
All right, user accounts get to be a lot more challenging because they have a lot more attributes. With a group, we really just had a name. I mean, not a group, sorry, an organizational unit. We really just have a name for the OU. But a user account is way bigger. So let me show you an example. I'm going to edit another file. So this is just called user.ldif. And here, I'm creating a user account for myself. And so you'll see I've specified the distinguished name up top. And this time, instead of OU equals, I'm saying UID equals, right? It's a user ID. And my user ID is Don Pizzette. And then the OU I'm going in is users. And then here's my domain, Lab IT Pro TV. But beyond that, we have a lot more. I have an object class. This one is inet.org person. That means I'm part of an organization. And then POSIX account. I'm going to be using this for doing Unix logins. And then shadow account. I'm going to have a password, and it needs to be stored in Linux's shadow file. So I have to designate 3 different object classes. These are like templates that are brought in from my user. Then I've got my common name of Don. I've got my surname, Pizzette. I've got my user password, and oh, the user password, that's a tricky one. So we actually have to generate that. I'm going to have to regenerate this one here. I'll do it in just a moment. But you'll see it's a hash, so I've got to generate that. The login shell, the user ID number, and the group ID number, you'll see I've set them to 10,001. That's from the last episode where we kind of set where our minimum was going to be. And a home directory, right? Now, I could stop right there, but user accounts also have a group. When we create a user account in Linux, we typically have a group with the same name. So right here, I'm creating a group to go along with it. And you'll see the type there is listed, or the object class is listed as a POSIX group. This is not an organizational unit. This is a group. And that group ID number is going to be 10,001. Common name is just Don Pizzette. Again, kind of mimicking what we would see in Linux. And then I'm just going to double check this file ahead of time, looking for any stray spaces that I might have. Looks good. So I think we're fine there. The only other thing I need to resolve here before I can create this user account is that password. I'm going to save this file. And from the command line, we actually have a utility that can generate the hash password for us. To do that, what you're going to run is the slap passwd command, or slap password. This is another utility that's installed with the slap utils package. And when I run it, just ask for what my password is going to be. So I'm going to do password 123. I'll re-enter it. And then it's going to generate the hash for me. And the hash is a little bit different on each system because of the way it's salted. And so that is going to be different than what I already had in the text file. So I'm going to copy that, and then I can just go back and edit that text file. I'm going to take it, or actually, I'm on the same virtual machine. It might actually be the same one, but just to be on the safe side, I'm going to go ahead and paste that in. No, it is different. So I'll paste that in. Now I've got everything I need to create that user account. I'm going to go ahead and save that file, and I'll import that one. And importing it is the same as before, so I'm going to use that same LDAP add command. The only difference is I need to point to my other LDIF file. And when I run that, it's going to do the import, and I must have typed my password wrong, so let me try that again. Password 123. You'd think I could type that. There we go. And I can see it's added my new entry. I've got my user created and my group created, and those are both now in Open LDAP. That user account's ready to go.
That kind of looks like a pain. But she did mention in the last episode that PHP LDAP admin might save us some time. So is that where this is going to factor in?
Yeah, absolutely. So, it is a pain. The first time you write one of these files, getting the syntax right. I mean, you look at my mistake. I had an extra space in there, and it threw everything off. So that's a bit of work. But after you've done it once, it becomes a copy and paste job. And so then it's not so bad, right? But if I'm creating thousands of users, then auto-generating an LDIF file is fine. But if I just need to create one user or one OU, it is kind of a pain to write a text file to do this, right? So that's where a graphical utility like PHP LDAP admin can save us a lot of time. And I want to show you that. So let's go back here. And I'm going to fire up good old Firefox here. We installed PHP LDAP admin in the last episode, but we haven't used it. So let me get logged into that. The address for it is just going to be whatever your server's IP is or name, followed by /PHP LDAP admin. That'll get you to the home page. The home page is not very flashy. And in fact, when we installed it, I just used default Apache. So it doesn't have SSL certificates on it. So I'm going to get a warning about this not being encrypted. In real life land, you'll want to stick some SSL certificates on that. Just follow the standard Apache instructions to do that. It's not logged in by default. So on the left side, I need to click login. And then it's going to ask who I'm logging in as. Now, it's going to assume that I want to log in with the admin account. We usually do. You could change that if it was a different account, but you have to put in the full distinguished name for that user, and then whatever the user's password happens to be. After that, you can authenticate, and on the left side, you'll have a nice little navigation tree that shows your Open LDAP directory. Well, we created a couple of OUs. Users, groups, computers. We created an account, Don Pizzette. We created a group called Don Pizzette. So I should be able to see all that. If I expand that out, I can see right here, there's the admin account that was created by default. And then I've got 3 OUs. And there's one object in each of these last 2 OUs. If I expand them out, I can see the user ID, Don Pizzette. And I can see the group. Here it's labeled as CN, Don Pizzette. So we've got those in place. Everything's showing up. This is the way we expect it to be, right? But easy to navigate, way better than Slapcat, right? Is when I get a bunch of junk on the screen. Here, I can actually click on my user. And the first time you use PHP LDAP admin and click on an object, you're going to get a bunch of errors. What it's doing is it's looking to see the software you installed and trying to match that up with its templates. We can create a lot of objects in OpenLDAP, and some of them only apply if you have the right software installed. So these errors can be ignored, but if I kind of dial in here, you'll see Samba SAM account was removed from the template. I don't have Samba installed on my directory server. Courier mail account was removed. I don't have courier mail installed. So if I don't have the software installed, it removes that so it doesn't show up. But then if I scroll down, now I see the user template, and it's not going to show me fields that don't apply to my system. But here I can see all the various values that we provided that related to that user account. And if I want to create something new, maybe I want to create a new organizational unit. Maybe I'm going to create one called marketing. So over here on the left side, I can go in the main tree, go all the way down to the bottom to create new entry here. And when I choose that, I'll see the available templates. And if there's something that's not installed, like SendMail over here or Samba, see how they've got red X's? So it's removed those templates so I can't use them. But if I want to create an organizational unit, I just find it here in the list and click on it and then give it a name. I'm going to call this one marketing. Hit create object. It gives me a summary of what it's about to add. I can hit commit. And now on the left side, I've got an OU named marketing. And if I want to create a group inside of there, well, I can click on the marketing OU. And it has to load. It does take a little bit of time. When you make a change, sometimes it takes a little while for it to recognize. It can take as long as like 15 minutes in some scenarios. But once this one loads, I'll be able to choose that OU, and I'll have a create new entry here item underneath it. But if that doesn't show up, I can always click on marketing, and on the right side, I'll have the create a child entry there too. So kind of a few different ways to work around it. I'll just create one under my groups OU instead. So if I want to create one under groups, I can click create new entry here. And then over here, I can pick the POSIX group, and I can give it a name. Maybe I'm about to make a user account for Sophie. So I want her to have a group. I'll call it Sophie G. So it's going to be the Sophie G group. I'll come back later and create a Sophie G user and put her in that group. I'll just go ahead and choose to create that object. It gives me the summary. I can see the group ID is already incremented by one number to avoid a duplicate, and I can commit that. And so now, with just a couple of clicks, I've created a new group, and I didn't have to go and create a text file to do it.
So it does save you a little bit of time, and even if you do have to wait a little bit, it looks like it's less likely you're going to make an error, or it's at least easier to see where you might make an error.
Absolutely.
So in this episode, we were able to look a little bit more at LDAP. We looked at OpenLDAP, object types, and LDIF files. We looked at creating OUs and user accounts using LDIF files. And we were able to look at creating objects using PHP LDAP admin to maybe save us a little bit of time and pain during that process. But we're not quite done with OpenLDAP yet, so don't go away. We've got more LPIC and OpenLDAP coming up, so stay tuned.
Thank you for watching IT Pro TV.
OpenLDAP does plain text authentication by default, but in this episode, we'll show you how to fix that with TLS.
You're watching IT Pro TV.
Welcome back to LPIC 2. I'm your host, Sophie, and I'm here with Dawn. And today we're going to continue our journey into OpenLDAP, specifically into configuring OpenLDAP with TLS. So what exactly does that mean? What are we going to talk about?
All right, well, we're going to start off with a little overview of what security OpenLDAP has or doesn't have, as is the case. And then we'll go into how we can actually secure it with TLS. We'll see how to generate some certificates, get them put in place, and then require secure connections for users authenticating against our OpenLDAP database.
Now, most people use OpenLDAP for authentication, so security is pretty important. So how does OpenLDAP handle secure access?
It does it really poorly, and the reason, and you know, it sounds negative when I say that way, but we have to remember that OpenLDAP was designed back in the 1990s when networks were more trustworthy. It was an internal-only service, and so security wasn't first and foremost in their thought. They were just working on having a stable object database that we could query against. Well, once they achieved that, then people realized, like, wait, some people are using this for authentication. We need security bolted on. And so they created something called, we usually call it SASL, which is SASL. That stands for the Simple Authentication and Security Layer. And it's actually SASL version 2 that we're on now. So you'll see SASL 2 used in a few places. What that is a framework that is stuck on top of OpenLDAP, and it allows us to bolt on whatever security we want. And you'll find there's a ton of different options that are available for authenticating against darn near anything if you want to set it up. OpenLDAP is extremely flexible. But one of the key things that it does that's important for us in this episode is it bolts on support for Transport Layer Security, or TLS. TLS is the replacement for SSL, Secure Socket Layer, that was used in web browsers for decades, but now is a higher level of security. So now we can let Open LDAP function the way that it was designed and still have secure communications, all without breaking the LDAP standard. Because the moment you start changing the way LDAP works, now you deviate from the standard and now you break compatibility. So this is really the best of both worlds. We get standards compliant Open LDAP and we get security stuck on. We just have to do a little more work to make it happen.
So we definitely want to get TLS configured. So where do we start with that?
All right, well, the first thing that we need, anytime you work with TLS, there's 3 components that you need. There's a certificate authority, so some trusted entity that's issuing certificates. Then we need a private key for our server. And finally, we need a public key or a public certificate that we're sharing with our clients to allow them to connect to us, or to allow them to encrypt data, send it to us, and we can decrypt it with our private key. So those are the 3 things that we need. Well, by default, OpenSSL isn't, well, it's installed in a lot of systems, but it doesn't generate those certificates for us. And Open LDAP doesn't come with those certificates by default, even Apache and other things. So we usually have to generate that ourselves. Now, in real life land, you can leverage public certificate authorities, things like Let's Encrypt, and do that. But if you're setting up Open LDAP as your own user authentication database, you usually don't want to leverage a public provider for that. You want your own private CA. If you've got a public key infrastructure, a PKI in place, you can leverage that, or you can just take your Open LDAP servers and make them self-signed certificates. It's not that hard to do, and then you can issue certificates that way. So you have a ton of choices. I'm going to show you generating the certificates right on the Open LDAP server and going that route. So this will be a totally closed system, and that's usually what we do want for an internal system. So for me to get this set up, the first thing I need to do is to generate some certificates. Now, you might already have some certificates if you go poking around. Like if I go into /etc/SSL and look in there, you might find some certs. You have to be root to get into some of these. So if I do sudo ls/etc/SSL/certs and look in there, I'll see a lot of the trusted certs that we have. Or if I look inside of, let's see, what's the other folder? Private. That's where my private keys would be. I can see Ubuntu has already created one for me called ssl-cert-snakeoil.key. They're letting me know that this is a key. I could use it, but the security provides is the equivalent of a snake oil salesman. It's fake security. I shouldn't use that cert. I need to generate my own. So step 1 is going to be generating my own certificate. I'm going to get back into my home directory. And to generate one, I'll just say OpenSSL gen RSA. So I'm generating an RSA certificate. I'm going to use AES 128 as my encryption. And then I'm going to output that to a file, which I'll just call openldap.key. This is going to be my private key that I'm generating. And I want it to be 2048 bits. You can do 4096. If you start going higher than 4096, you can run into some compatibility problems. 2048 is pretty good for right now. And you could also choose to do like AES 256. You could go stronger if you wanted. Now, when I generate that, it needs a passphrase, and it won't let me skip the passphrase. So I've got to put in a password here. That's a problem because I don't want a password on this. Otherwise, a service won't be able to use it. If a service tries to load it, it can't provide the password. So I'm going to strip that password out by running OpenSSL RSA -in. So I'm going to load the Open LDAP key that we just created and then say -out. And I'm going to output to the same file. When I do this, this is an automated process. It wants a passphrase. I have to give it the current passphrase, but then it doesn't ask for a passphrase to go back on it. This strips the passphrase off it. Now I've got a certificate that's ready to use. All right, now this isn't actually a certificate. This is just a private key. I need to get this private key digitally signed so I can then generate public keys off of it. So I need to generate a certificate signing request. I'll say OpenSSL REQ, so I'm doing a request, -new. I'll set the days I want this certificate to be valid for. I'm going to do 20 years. 20 years, this is my main directory, right? So it's going to be around a while. 20 years is 7,300 days. And then it's going to ask me a few questions. It's asking for a passphrase if I'm going to assign one. This one actually, I thought it would let me skip, but it won't. So let me run that again. And we will, oh, actually, did I leave something out? I did leave something out. Shoot. I'm requesting a key, basically, right? So I need to tell it what the key is. That's kind of an important thing. So I said days 7300 dash key open LDAP.key. That's the key that I've already generated that I want signed. And I'm going to output the request as open LDAP.CSR certificate signing request. You can use whatever extension you want, but that's kind of the standard one. Now when I run that, there we go. That's what I was supposed to see in the first place. It's going to ask me for my country name and so on. So I've got to fill this out. I'm in the U.S., state or province. I'm in Florida. Locality, I'm in Gainesville. Then my organization, this is IT Pro TV. My organizational unit name, we'll just say this is the IT department. Common name, so this is the fully qualified domain name for this system. So in my case, that's going to be lab.itpro.tv. All right. Email address, so who's responsible for this? I'll just say admin@lab.itpro.tv. And then the password that we're going to be assigning to the certificate request. Now I'm going to leave that blank. I should be able to leave it blank this time. Yep, there we go. So I'm leaving that blank, which is what I tried to do a moment ago. And now I've got my certificate signing request generated right there. Open LDAP.CSR waiting for me to do something with it. Okay. The next thing I need to do is I need to take that and sign it. Now, normally I would take that to DigiCert or somebody else and get them to do it. I'd pay them, but I'm just going to sign my own. So to do that, we say open SSL X509, that's the format of the certificate, dash in, I'm going to bring in that open LDAP.CSR file, dash out, I'm going to output that as open LDAP.CRT, this will be my actual certificate. I will do dash REQ, what I'm requesting them to do, and that's going to be dash sign key. I'm requesting them to sign the key for me, and then the name of the output file is going to be open LDAP.key, and the days, this is going to be 7,300 days. So once I've got all that in place, that's going to go through, it's going to digitally sign it, right? So now I've got a private key, I've got a digitally signed key that I can use to generate public certificates to hand out, and I need a trusted CA. Well, I'm the trusted CA. So the last thing I need to do is get all of these files that I just generated in the right place for Open LDAP to use them. So I'll have to copy some things around. I'll do sudo cp, I want to copy open LDAP.key, and I want to send that to /etc/ldap/sazl2. So I want it to be in that directory. That's why I have to sudo this one. And I also want open LDAP.crt. That's my certificate. The private key and the certificate both need to be there. And then since I'm the CA, I also need to copy, I'll do sudo cp/ssl/certificates.crt. So that's the trusted CAs of which my server trusts itself. So it'll be in there. I'm going to copy that one to /etc/ldap/sazl2 and send that one over. So now all three of those files are where they need to be. They're all in /etc/ldap/sazl2. If I look in there, there's my three files. I just need to change the ownership so that Open LDAP will be able to read them. So I'll say sudo chown, and I'm going to change that to the Open LDAP user, and I'm going to set that for really everything that's in here. So I'll just do /* and pull up that listing. So now Open LDAP owns them, the files are there, now I've got my certificates in place. That's really the hard part of this whole process.
Now, do we have to tell the clients and the server to use the certificates, or does Open LDAP handle that from here?
We do have to tell it, right? 'Cause, the file names that I use, they kind of look like official file names. You can use whatever file name you want. And you could really put them other places, too. This is the default location they're expected to be, but they could reside somewhere else. Like if you use Let's Encrypt, they're going to be stored in the Let's Encrypt folder. So we need to tell Open LDAP about these certificates and where they can go to retrieve them. And we do it in a weird way. Instead of editing the config file, we actually need to create an LDIF file to import these in. And I've already created one. So I've got a file here called tls.ldif. Let me edit that so you can see it. And we'll just look at what's in there. It doesn't take much. There's 3 entries. The first entry is telling them the root certificate authority. So who is the root CA that we're using? And I'm pointing to that CA certificates file that I just copied over a moment ago. All right. Then we have to replace the fake TLS certificate that's already in there with the one that we're using, which is the open LDAP CRT file. And we have to replace the key with the one that we made. So just specifying those changes so that open LDAP will recognize those. So once I've got that in place, we just need to import that LDIF file and we'll be ready to rock. So for that, I'll do sudo LDAP modify dash capital Y. So I'm telling it that I'm using Sazzle for my authentication with that. And so this is going to be an external authentication. And then dash H, which is telling it the LDAP server I'm connecting to. Well, because it's local, I'm actually on my server, I can just type LDAP I : ///. That's a shortcut for saying this server. I want it to be right here. If it was a remote server, I'd have to put in the IP address after that. And then dash F, this is the file that I'm going to load. My file is called tls.ldif, so I'll just punch in that file name. And that's going to import that configuration. Hopefully I get a successful message. I see modified, the container common name config. That one has been updated. And now it's got those settings in there. They don't actually take effect until I restart slapd. So I'll do a sudo systemctl restart slapd. So now that restarts, it's going to load up. Now it sees the certificates, brings them online, and gets them ready to use.
So how can we test it to make sure that it's actually working?
Well, that's the tricky part. So from the server itself, there's not really a good way to test it, right? So the best way to test it is to go to a client. We want to get a client authenticating using all of this. We've been building infrastructure for 2 episodes now. So we want clients to authenticate and use it, but we haven't set that up yet. So let's do this. Stay tuned for the next episode. In the next episode, we're going to configure a client to connect to our open LDAP directory and actually authenticate. And when that happens, we'll set the client to require TLS. If we made a mistake here, TLS won't work, the client won't connect. But if we got everything entered in correctly, the client will connect, and then we'll know that TLS is working properly.
And like Don said, we'll talk more about that in the next episode. But as for this episode, we were able to discuss security in Open LDAP. We talked about creating server certificates and enabling TLS in Open LDAP. But stay tuned. Obviously, we've got more coming, as we've said, so don't go away, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you for watching IT Pro TV.
So we've got an Open LDAP server set up. So now it's time for the exciting stuff. Let's look at how to get a client connected and authenticated.
You're watching IT Pro TV.
Welcome back. I'm your host, Sophie, here with Don Pizzette for more on LPIC 2, more on Open LDAP, specifically connecting a client to Open LDAP. Can we kind of look at an overview of what this episode's about?
Sure. You know, having an open LDAP server is exciting, but it's not incredibly useful until we get a client connected to it. So in this episode, we'll talk about some of the concerns with getting a client set up. We'll go through installing the packages and making the configuration changes. And by the end of the episode, we'll be able to take a Linux server and log in with a user account that exists in our open LDAP directory.
Now, most Linux systems don't have Open LDAP installed, so how do they know if we want to authenticate with it?
All right, well, the short answer to that is they don't, right? So Open LDAP is an open source technology. It's included in almost every distro's repositories, but I don't think it's ever installed by default on any of them. I've never seen a system that had it installed by default. And that means if you go to any standard Linux client, it has no expectation of connecting to Open LDAP. In fact, it might not even know about Open LDAP at all. But fortunately, there is something that's installed by default on Linux clients, and it's something called PAM. PAM is the pluggable authentication modules, and it's a framework that lets us add in all sorts of different types of methods of authentication. And we're thinking about Open LDAP right here. We've kind of got our tunnel vision turned on, but PAM supports a ton of things like Radius authentication, Microsoft's Active Directory, NIS Plus servers if you're in a time machine. It can do multi-factor authentication. Some people have smart cards. You just plug a smart card in and log in. Well, there's PAM modules for all of those. You just pick the right module and stick it on there. Well, we can do the same thing with Open LDAP. We stick the Open LDAP module onto PAM, and now the Linux server or client, when we go to log in, it'll know, hey, I have my local users, but I can also talk to this server over here and there's more users standing by that I just need to authenticate with and go. So we just have to get that set up. When we set up OpenLDAP, it's easy to focus on the OpenLDAP piece like we've been doing these last couple of episodes, but there's actually another piece that comes along with it that's called NSLCD, which is the Name Service LDAP Connection Daemon. And what this is a service that when we add the OpenLDAP module to PAM, it's what's going to run in the background to do the name lookups, to be able to find the directory server to get connected and let us log in. So it's kind of an important piece of this. We haven't talked about it in a previous episode because we've been focused on the server. This is more of a client-only thing. And even then, we don't directly interact with it. It's just something that runs in the background. So in order to get our Linux client connected, it's really PAM and the NSLCD that are all doing that work in the background that's providing that connectivity.
So PAM is installed by default, so we're good to go there. But is there anything else that we need to install?
Yes, so we need to install some OpenLDAP modules to be able to actually get all this to work, and we've got to tell the system to use it. Fortunately, the process isn't that hard. You can even automate it with a script if you need to make it really easy to join machines to your OpenLDAP directory. So let me show you how that works. So this is my directory server. I'm going to open up another tab, and I'm going to connect to another server that I've got on my network. And right now, I'm going to log into that server as my DPZ account. So DPZ is a local account that's on that server. I can get into it, and there we go. If I cat the /etc/passwd file, I can see that the DPZ user is actually the only custom user that's been added to the system, has a UID of 1000. Well, I've got a donPZ user that I created in OpenLDAP. It has a user ID of 10,001. It's not in this list, so that user cannot log in right now. But when we add on the authentication pieces here in a moment, our client's going to become aware of that directory, and I should be able to log in with that user account that doesn't even exist right now. All right, but there's a few things that we've got to get set up. The first are some packages. So I'm going to say sudo apt install, and the packages I need to install, first I'm going to do lib nss-ldapd. So that's going to let us do name service lookups on LDAPD. Then lib pam-ldapd. So there's the pluggable authentication module for LDAP. And then I'm also going to add the ldap-utils. This is technically an optional module, but because we're doing the configuration by hand, we need it. So I'll go ahead and load that one too. So it's going to install those. Now notice when I do the install, the following additional packages will be installed. That's where NSLCD creeps up and its various pieces. So, again, it's kind of a required component, but it's going to install automatically. So I'll just say yes and let those get installed. When it's done installing, now it's going to ask me 3 simple questions. And the first one is, where's my OpenLDAP server, right? And you can specify more than one. You just put a space or a comma in between them. So if you have 5 OpenLDAP servers, you can put them all in there. It's great for redundancy. I've only got 1. Because I'm not running a very stable network. So I'll punch in the IP address of my OpenLDAP server. On the next screen, it's going to ask me for the domain name or the organization that I'm using inside of OpenLDAP. Mine, if you remember from the last episode, is DC equals lab, DC equals IT Pro, DC equals TV. So that's the domain name that I'm using inside of OpenLDAP. And then the last question is, which services do I need to support with OpenLDAP? Well, for doing user authentication, you need the first 3. I need passwd. The user account needs to be valid as far as passwd is concerned. When I looked at the passwd file a moment ago, the user wasn't there, right? I also need shadow file support. The user has a password. Passwords aren't stored in passwd anymore like they used to. They used to be plain text in there. Now they're encrypted and stored in shadows, or they're hashed in shadow. And then group. There might be groups located in OpenLDAP, and I need to be able to pull those as well. Every user has to, at a minimum, have one group attached to them. We need to see that. So those are the 3 things that we need. There's other name lookup options down here. Protocols, services, we don't need any of those. If we were doing Radius or something else, then it'd be a different story. I'm not. So we're just doing user authentication. We need those 3. All right, and with that, it's going to finish that configuration, so it drops that in. Technically, that's all I need to do, but there's 2 extra things that I want to take care of before I go further. If I stop right now, it works, but it doesn't work exactly right. There's 2 problems. Problem number 1, the user home directories aren't going to get created. Users would log in and they would get no home directory. And then problem number 2 is it would be doing unencrypted authentication. So let's fix both of those real quick. The first thing I'm going to do is the login directories. I need to do sudo edit /etc/pam.d /common-session. These are common session settings for users when they log in. And you'll see a bunch of stuff in here that's basically default values. I'm just going to go all the way to the bottom of the file, and I will add in right here at the very bottom, I'll say session optional. This is an optional attribute. I'll hit tab. This is going to modify pam_mkhomdir.so. So that's the library that creates home directories. And I'm going to tell it skel equals /etc/skel. When a user logs in, create a home directory for them and clone the skeleton folder. That's what happens to a local user. I'm saying do the same thing for a network user. Just clone that folder. And then I need to set a umask for permissions. I want the user to have full access and everyone else to have nothing. And so that is 077. It's kind of the opposite of file permissions, which would normally be like 700. So that's going to be the umask for this one.
I don't want to interrupt you, but I think you might have a typo.
Uh-oh.
PMA, I think.
PMA, that is not how you spell
See,
PAM.
I know some things. I know some things.
All right, that would have been a problem. So the home directory wouldn't have been created. We would have logged in, but got no home directory. So you saved us some trouble there.
Right.
All right, so I will save that. And then I mentioned it's not going to be secure by default. So let's fix that. I'll say sudo edit /etc/nslcd.conf. So there's nslcd. And you'll see some various settings in here. I don't really want to mess with most of these. I'm just going to go to the very bottom and say SSL space start_TLS. So whenever we do a connection, start TLS. And then TLS_REQCERT, so request certificate. I'm going to request that root cert. I'm going to allow that. That's going to tell it to do an encrypted, secured TLS connection when we do authentication. So with that in place, now we've got it configured, and all I have to do is reboot, and there we go. Now it's set up for every user, so that is what it takes to get a client connected to OpenLDAP.
So that was pretty painless, but how can we test to make sure that it's actually working?
Well, the easiest way is to try and log in on that system as a user account that doesn't exist on the system, right? So I know my dpazet user, that's a local user that's on the system, not exciting. But my donpazet user, that's something new. It's not in passwd. If I can log in with that, I'll get in. And so, when I SSH'd into it a moment ago, so here, I'll pull up my string. I did SSH dpazet at and the IP of the server. I had certificate-based authentication set up, so it didn't ask for a password, just let me write in, right? And if I go in, just making sure the server is up, I'll run ID, and I can see my user ID is 1000. That's my local user. I'm going to exit, and I'm going to try again, but this time I'm going to try and use the donpazet user. That user is not a local user. That user exists in my OpenLDAP directory, and that's it. And so when I run that, I don't have certificate authentication set up for that, so it's going to ask for the password. So I'll provide the password, and if it worked, I should log in. And I did log in. I can see in my prompt down here, donpazet add Ubuntu server, so that's good. If I do ID, I can see my user ID is not 1000. My user ID is 10,001. And if I look at my home directory, I'm in /home/donpazet. And if I pull up a listing of /home, I can see there's 2 separate folders because I'm logged in as a whole separate user, right? This is not the user that I've been logging in with this whole series. If I take a look at /etc/passwd and look at the end, I don't see donpazet in that list. And that's because it's not a local user. But I do see NSLCD, which is that warning, basically letting the system know, hey, there's more users, they're just not here in this file. You've got to go and look at a server, reach out to NSLCD, it'll help you find that, right? If I take a look at the shadow file, well, in this case, I'll have to sudo that. And, oh, shoot, this user can't sudo. I'm going to get an error here. Well, whatever. So if I take a look at that shadow file, then I'll see basically the same thing there, right? The user's password isn't a local password. The user's password is stored in OpenLDAP, and that's what we're authenticating against. Let me switch over to my other account, and I will cat/etc/shadow. And oops, I forgot to sudo it after saying all of that. But when I look here, same thing. I don't see Don Pizzette, not in the list. I do see NSLCD. Don Pizzette is stored in that OpenLDAP directory. So in this scenario, I know for a fact I'm logged in with that OpenLDAP user. And if I have 500 Linux boxes and I connect them all to my OpenLDAP server, I can now go to any one of those servers and log in as Don Pizzette. And if I change my password on one of them, it will change my password across all of them because they're all pulling from the OpenLDAP directory. I now have a centralized user database and centralized groups and so on. I've got a nice, good security structure.
This is a great way to kind of wrap up this episode on OpenLDAP. We got to take a look at how clients connect. We looked at configuring a client. And lastly, we looked at testing authentication just to make sure everything's working correctly. And that's all we've really got for OpenLDAP, but we're definitely not done with LPIC just yet, so don't go away. Stick around, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you for watching IT Pro TV.